June 1988, in the low, rolling hills of Calhoun County, the heat was not a guest. It was the new landlord. It settled over the pastures and the cornfields, bleaching the sky to a pale, hazy indifference. The creeks, which had run full and brown in April, were now just suggestions of their former selves, trickling through cracked mud plains littered with the smooth, dry bodies of river stones. The air itself felt thin, robbed of its moisture, and every pickup truck that passed on the county road raised a plume of fine, tin dust that hung in the still air for minutes before settling on everything. It was the beginning of a drought that men would talk about for decades, a slow, relentless squeezing of the land. Arthur Pearsall felt it in his bones. He was 72 years old, and his body had kept its own almanac for most of those years. The stiffness in his knuckles in the morning, the ache in his lower back, they were more reliable than any forecast on the radio. He had seen dry spells come and go, had seen the panic rise and fall in the voices of his neighbors at the co-op. This felt different. This felt like a deep, foundational thirst, a dryness that started somewhere far below the topsoil and was working its way up. He stood at the edge of his 10-acre apple orchard. To most eyes, it was a mess. While the other orchards in the county were pristine, their rows tilled to a fine, dark powder or sprayed, so clean you could see the shadow of every tree stalk against the bare earth, Arthur's was a riot of life. Between his trees, a thick, knee-high carpet of vegetation grew green and dense. It was a chaotic mix of white and crimson clover, wiry stalks of vetch with their delicate purple flowers, the saw-toothed leaves of dandelions, the feathery tops of yarrow, and the tough, deep-rooted chicory that would soon send up brilliant blue flowers. To the casual observer, it looked like neglect. It looked like a man who had given up, who had let his land go to weed. Frank Miller, whose immaculate orchard sat 3 miles down the road, had said as much at the feed store. Pearsall's letting the weeds take him, he had announced to the men gathered by the counter. Shame to see it. That was a good piece of land once, the others had nodded in agreement, a chorus of pity for the old man who had lost his way. They saw an unkempt field. Arthur Pearsall saw a system. He had planted these trees, or most of them, with his father, Thomas, 40 years ago. They were a mix of stamen, winesap, rome, and a few old Virginia beauty trees that his grandfather had put in the ground. Their trunks were gnarled and thick, their bark a testament to decades of sun, wind, and ice. They were his life's work, but he knew they were only half of the equation. The other half was the ground they grew from, and that was where his attention had always been. The problem of the drought was not yet a crisis for most. It was a concern, a topic of conversation over coffee. The county extension agent, a young man named David Klein, had made his rounds, handing out pamphlets on irrigation efficiency and water conservation. He had visited Arthur a week prior. Klein was sharp, educated, with a degree in agronomy from the state university. He carried a stainless steel soil moisture probe and a clipboard, and he spoke in terms of evapotranspiration rates and soil porosity indexes. He had walked into Arthur's orchard, his polished boots a stark contrast to the wild growth, and his brow had furrowed. He took a few steps, the clover and vetch brushing against his clean khaki pants. He stopped and looked at Arthur, a look of professional concern on his face. "Mr. Pearsall," he had said, his voice polite but firm, "you've got a significant weed problem here. This cover crop, it's competing with your trees for moisture. In a dry year like this, that's the last thing you want. Every drop of water these weeds are taking is a drop your apples aren't getting." Arthur had just listened, his hands resting on a weathered fence post. He had heard this before. He had heard it from Klein's predecessor and the one before that. It was the modern way, the scientific way. Bare earth was clean earth. Anything that grew where you did not plant, it was a thief. Klein had pulled out his probe, a sleek, digital instrument. He tried to push it into the ground between the trees. It went a few inches and stopped. He tried again, with more force. "Ground's getting hard already," he said, stating the obvious. He finally found a spot where he could work it in. He read the digital display. "You're at 32% moisture content at 6 inches. That's borderline. My recommendation is to get a mower in here, cut this all down. Then I'd come through with a broad-spectrum herbicide, kill it off. Then till it under. You need to create a dust mulch on the surface to conserve what little water you have left. Arthur had looked at the young man. He saw the confidence, the certainty that came from books and classrooms. He did not see disrespect, only a different kind of knowledge, one that believed it had superseded all others. He had simply nodded. "I'll think on it," he had said. It was his standard reply to advice he had no intention of taking. Klein, satisfied that he had done his duty, made a few more notes on his clipboard. "The county has a cost-share program for installing drip irrigation," he added, trying to be helpful. "With the way this summer is shaping up, it might be the only thing that saves your crop. Frank Miller is putting his in next week. It's a significant investment, but a total crop loss is more significant." He clicked his pen, smiled a professional smile, and left. Arthur had watched his clean, county-owned sedan drive away, leaving a trail of dust that settled slowly on the green leaves of the chicory by the fence line. The history of this particular piece of land was written in failures as much as successes. The previous owner, a man named Henderson who had farmed it before the Pearsalls, had believed in clean tilling. Arthur's father had told him the stories. Henderson had plowed every inch, every year, believing that turning the soil was the only way to keep it healthy. He had fought the weeds with a cultivator and a hoe, and his fields were, for a time, the cleanest in the county. Then came the dry years of the 1930s. The wind had come, and with nothing to hold it, Henderson's topsoil had lifted up into the air and blown into the next state. He went bankrupt. When Thomas Pearsall bought the land, it was worn out, eroded, and poor. The first thing he did was not plant a cash crop. He planted clover. He planted buckwheat. He planted vetch. He spent 3 years just growing blankets for the soil, tilling nothing, letting the roots of his cover crops do the plowing for him. The neighbors had thought him a fool then, too. Pearsall's farming weeds, they had said. But after 3 years, when he finally put in a crop of corn, the yield was double that of the surrounding farms. He had understood something they had forgotten. The ground was not dirt. It was a living thing, and like any living thing, it did not like to be left naked and exposed. This principle was the foundation of everything Arthur did. It was a quiet rebellion against the modern consensus. The men at the co-op, good men all, had embraced the new sciences. They bought the latest hybrid seeds, the most powerful chemical fertilizers, the most effective herbicides. Their fields were marvels of industrial efficiency. And for years, in the wet years, it had worked. Their yields were enormous. Their orchards, with the ground beneath them as bare as a tabletop, were easy to manage, easy to harvest. They saw Arthur's methods as a quaint relic, a stubborn refusal to accept progress. They pitted him for his lower yields, for the extra work of managing his chaotic undergrowth. They did not understand that he was not managing for the best years. He was managing for the worst. Now, the worst year was coming. The radio spoke of a high-pressure system, a heat dome, stalled over the entire region. No significant rain was in the forecast. Not for a week, not for a month. Arthur could see the first signs of stress in the landscape. The oaks at the edge of the woods were beginning to curl their leaves, a defense mechanism to reduce water loss. The corn in the fields down the road, which should have been shoulder-high and dark green, was stunted, a pale, yellowish green, its leaves rolling tight like cigars in the afternoon sun. His own trees looked fine. Their leaves were a deep, healthy green, showing no sign of wilt. He walked between the rows, his boots silent on the living carpet. He knelt down, parting the clover. The ground beneath was dark and cool to the touch. He could feel the moisture in it, a subtle dampness that was absent from the baked earth just beyond his fence line. He dug into the soil with his bare hands, a few inches down. It crumbled easily, rich and loamy. He saw the thin, white threads of mycelium, the fungal network that connected everything. He saw earthworms, fat and healthy. The ground was alive. He knew why. The thick mat of vegetation acted as a living mulch. It shaded the soil from the brutal, baking sun. The sun, his father had always said, was a hammer on bare ground. It pounded the life out of it, baked it into a brick, destroyed its structure. This green blanket kept the soil temperature degrees cooler, dramatically reducing evaporation. More than that, it captured the dew. In the cool of the pre-dawn hours, when the temperature dropped, moisture condensed on the millions of leaves and stems of the clover and the yarrow. It dripped down, providing a small but crucial daily drink to the soil. On a bare field, that dew would be gone in the first 5 minutes of sunlight. Here, it was captured and held. And the plants themselves were not thieves, as Klein believed. They were partners. The clover, a legume, was actively fixing nitrogen from the air and putting it into the soil, a free source of fertilizer for the apple trees. The chicory and dandelions, with their powerful taproots, were mining for minerals deep in the clay subsoil, pulling them up into the topsoil, where the shallower roots of the apple trees could access them. They were breaking up the compacted layers of earth, creating channels for water to penetrate when the rains did eventually come. It was a complex, self-sustaining system, one that had been perfected by nature long before the first bag of chemical fertilizer was ever sold. Arthur did not need a digital probe to know this. He had a better instrument, a simple steel soil auger, the same one his father had used. It was nothing more than a T-handle welded to a 4-foot-long, corkscrew-like shaft. He carried it with him now. He chose a spot midway between two winesap trees and began to turn the handle. The auger bit into the earth with a satisfying grind. It passed easily through the top few inches of rich humus, then met the firmer resistance of the clay subsoil. He kept turning, his shoulders working in a steady, practiced rhythm. He pulled out. The spiral grooves of the auger were filled with soil. The first foot was dark and moist. The second foot was still damp, a lighter brown. The third foot was still cool and held a trace of moisture. He crumbled it in his hand. It held its shape when he squeezed it. There was water here, deep down. He had banked it. Every thunderstorm, every spring shower for the past several years had soaked into this living sponge, not run off the surface of a sealed, crusted field. He was not living on the current rainfall. He was living on savings. He did this quietly. He did not argue with the men at the co-op. He did not call the extension agent to tell him he was wrong. He simply continued his work. His days fell into a familiar rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of his land. He was up before dawn, watching the light come up over the eastern hills. He walked the orchard, observing. Observation was the most important tool he owned. He noted which sections of clover were thickest. He saw where the deer had bedded down in the cool green. He watched the bees and other pollinators moving from blossom to blossom, not just on his apple trees earlier in the season, but now on the clover and vetch, keeping the entire ecosystem buzzing with life. His tools were old, but meticulously maintained. He had a 1952 Ford 8-in tractor, its gray and red paint faded, but its engine perfectly tuned. He used it not for tilling, but for pulling a sickle bar mower, which he would run through the orchard perhaps twice a year, cutting the tall growth and letting it lie where it fell, adding to the layer of mulch. He had not done that yet this year. He would let it grow as long as possible to provide maximum shade and protection for the soil. His primary tool in the summer was a scythe. It was an Austrian scythe, light and sharp, with a long, curved wooden snaft that he had shaped to fit his own body. He would walk through the rows in the cool of the morning, the scythe seeming to float in his hands. He was not clear-cutting. He was selectively trimming, thinning patches that were too thick, cutting back the vegetation around the base of the young trees, making paths. The rhythmic sh-ch-ch-ch-ch of the blade was the only sound, a stark contrast to the roar of the diesel mowers on other farms. The men who drove by on the road saw an old man with an obsolete tool doing what looked like pointless work. They did not see the careful, surgical precision of it, the decades of practice in his movements. The memory of his father was a constant presence. It was not a ghost, but a foundation. He remembered a specific day, a summer much like this one in the early 1950s. He had been a teenager, full of the new ideas he was learning in his high school agriculture class. They had taught him about chemical fertilizers, about the importance of eliminating all competition for the main crop. He had argued with his father in the shade of a massive oak tree that still stood at the corner of the property. "Dad, we have to clear the rows," he had insisted, parroting his teacher. The book says this clover is stealing water and nitrogen from the trees. His father, Thomas, a man of few words, had not argued back. He had simply knelt down, just as Arthur had done for himself a few days ago. He had dug his hands into the soil under the clover and held up a clump of earth, dark and crawling with worms. "Does that look stolen from?" he had asked. Then he had walked over to the edge of their property, to the fence line they shared with Henderson's old, tilled field. He had kicked at the bare, cracked ground. A puff of dust rose. "That," he said, pointing at the lifeless dirt, "is stolen from. The sun and the wind are the thieves, son, not the clover. The clover is the watchman. It stands guard. Bare ground is sick ground, and it's always begging for a drink. Covered ground takes care of itself." That lesson had been the core principle, the central thesis of Arthur's entire farming life. The world had gone one way, chasing bigger yields, more immediate profits, relying on solutions that came in bags and jugs. He had held to his father's wisdom. He had refined it, learned the names of more plants, understood their specific functions, the deep-rooting chicory, the nitrogen-fixing vetch, the mineral-accumulating yarrow, but the principle remained unchanged. Feed the soil, and the soil will feed the tree. This knowledge was not written in any university textbook that David Klein had read. It was a physical knowledge stored in a small, leather-bound notebook that Arthur kept on his bedside table. It was his father's notebook, and his grandfather's before that. The pages were filled with observations, written in faded ink. June 1934. No rain for 40 days. Henderson's corn is burnt up. Our patch, planted in the vetch field, is still green, May 1947. Heavy spring rain, till fields wash bad. Our orchard held every drop. It was a record, a testament, a physical manifestation of generational knowledge. Arthur had added his own notes over the years, a quiet conversation across time with the men who had taught him. July 1988, he had written last night. Klein from the county says to kill the cover. Skies like brass. No rain. As July deepened, the drought tightened its grip. The official reports on the radio became more dire. The governor declared a state of emergency in half the counties, including Calhoun. Water restrictions were put in place. The chorus of skeptics at the co-op grew louder, but their tone began to shift from pity for Arthur to anxiety for themselves. Frank Miller had installed his drip irrigation system. It was a marvel of modern technology, a network of black plastic tubing that snaked through his pristine rows, delivering a precise amount of water directly to the base of each tree. He ran it every night, drawing from his deep well. For a few weeks, it seemed to work. His trees perked up, but the well level began to drop at an alarming rate, and the system did nothing to cool the ground itself. The sun beat down on the bare earth between his trees, and the heat radiating from the soil stressed the trees almost as much as the lack of water. The leaves on his trees, while not wilting, took on a dull, grayish cast. Other neighbors were not so fortunate. The Gable family, on the next ridge over, relied on a pond for their irrigation. By mid-July, the pond was a muddy puddle. They had to stop watering entirely. Their trees were the first to show severe stress. The leaves began to yellow and drop, carpeting the clean-tilled ground. The young apples, deprived of water, stopped growing. Then they, too, began to fall, hitting the hard, baked earth with a series of soft, tragic thuds. The community watched and worried. The men at the feed store spoke in low tones. They talked about crop insurance, about federal aid, about the price of feed for their cattle, since the pastures have been grazed down to stubble. They rarely mentioned Arthur Pearsall anymore. His quiet, green corner of the county was becoming an anomaly, a strange outlier that didn't fit the narrative of universal suffering. To mention it felt like acknowledging a failure they couldn't quite define. David Klein was a busy man. He drove the county roads from dawn until dusk, his clipboard filling with grim data. He measured dropping water tables, calculated yield losses, and advised farmers on the brutal triage of cutting their losses. He saw fields of corn and soybeans that were a total write-off, the stalks brown and brittle, not even fit for silage. He saw proud, Hardworking men look at their life's work turning to dust, and he offered what comfort he could in the form of paperwork for disaster relief. On his routes, he had to pass Arthur Pearsall's farm. Each time he slowed his sedan, he looked at the messy, overgrown orchard, and he felt a growing sense of cognitive dissonance. According to his training, according to every principle of modern agronomy, those trees should be suffering the most. The weeds should have long since choked them out, stealing the last vestiges of moisture. But they were not. From the road, the orchard was an oasis of deep, vibrant green in a landscape of brown and pale yellow. The leaves on Arthur's trees were lush and full. There was no yellowing, no leaf drop. Through his binoculars, Klein could see apples on the branches, swelling and healthy. It made no sense. His data, his education, his entire professional framework told him that what he was seeing was impossible. Yet there was. He began to make a point of driving by in the early morning. He saw the old man, a silhouette against the rising sun, moving through the tall growth with that strange, old-fashioned tool, the scythe. He watched Arthur work, the smooth, efficient motions that bespoke a lifetime of practice. It was not the flailing of a man clearing brush. It was a kind of gardening, precise and deliberate. Klein started to wonder if what he had dismissed as weeds was, in fact, something else entirely. He began to question his initial assessment. Pride, however, kept him from stopping. He was the expert. He was the one with the degree. The first undeniable sign of success, visible to everyone, came in late July. A hot, dry wind blew for 3 days straight. It was a killer wind, a desiccant that sucked the last bit of life from already stressed plants. When finally died down, the damage across the county was catastrophic. Frank Miller's orchard looked like it had been torched. A third of his leaves had been stripped from the trees, and the ones that remained were brown and curled at the edges. The fruit was shriveled, sun-scorched on the branches. It was a disaster. The day after the wind stopped, Arthur Pearsall was out in his orchard as usual. From the road, his trees looked completely untouched. They stood calm and green, their leaves barely rustled, protected by the dense, ground-hugging ecosystem that surrounded them. The thick undergrowth had acted as a windbreak, slowing the hot, dry air at the ground level, creating a pocket of cooler, more humid, and stiller air within the orchard. The difference was not subtle. It was stark and absolute. This was the turning point for David Klein. The visual evidence was too powerful to ignore. The next morning, he did not just drive by. He parked his sedan by the fence. He got out and stood there for a long time, just looking. The foil, the man of new systems, was having his moment of reevaluation. He looked from the green, living world inside Arthur's fence to the brown, dying one in the fields across the road. He looked at his clipboard, at the columns of numbers and projections. The numbers lied. The reality was in front of him. He pulled out his soil moisture probe. He walked to the fence line of a neighboring property, a soybean field that had been tilled clean in the spring. The soybeans were now just withered sticks. He pushed the probe into the baked earth. It was like trying to push steel into concrete. He finally managed to get it in 6 inches. The reading on the digital display was stark, 8%, critically dry, essentially dead soil. He stood up and looked over at Arthur, who was working with his scythe near the far end of the orchard. He did not wave or call out. He just watched the old man, who seemed to be a part of the landscape itself. After a moment, Klein walked back to his car. He sat there, the engine off, the window down, the hot air pressing in. He was supposed to have the answers. He was the one people called for help, and he had given this man the worst possible advice. He had told him to kill the very thing that was saving his farm. It was a humbling, deeply uncomfortable realization. He felt the sting of his own arrogance. The climax of the drought arrived in the first week of August. The temperature spiked to 105 degrees and stayed there for 4 consecutive days. The sun was relentless. The local radio station issued health warnings for people and livestock. At the co-op, the talk was of selling off herds, of plowing under entire fields. The mood was grim, funereal. Frank Miller's well ran dry. The pump sucked air, and the expensive drip irrigation system went silent. His orchard was now completely at the mercy of the heat. The final undeniable result of his methods, of the clean-tilled, modern approach, was a field of dying trees. The apples, what was left of them, were small, hard, and bitter. It was a total crop loss. The bank that held the loan on his new irrigation system was not going to be pleased. In Arthur Pearsall's orchard, the system held. The trees showed some stress now, a slight curling of the leaves at the very top, but they remained green. The apples were still on the branches, smaller than they would have been in a wet year, but healthy and maturing. The ground beneath them, protected by its living blanket, remained alive. He had not won a resounding victory. He had simply endured. In a year like 1988, endurance was the only victory that mattered. The success could be quantified. Arthur walked the rows, picking a few sample apples. He cut one open with his pocket knife. The flesh was crisp and juicy. The flavor was concentrated, intensely sweet and tart. His yield would be down, perhaps by 30%, but he would have a crop, a valuable crop, given that he might be the only one in the county with apples to sell. He would not make a fortune, but he would pay his taxes by what he needed for the winter and put a little aside. He was not in debt. The math did not require a pencil. He had saved his farm, and it had cost him nothing but his own labor and a lifetime of paying attention. A few days later, after the worst of the heat wave had broken, replaced by the same old oppressive, dry heat, David Klein returned. This time, he didn't park on the road. He pulled his car into Arthur's gravel driveway and got out. He walked slowly, uncertainly, toward the old farmhouse. He looked like a man coming to confess his sin. Arthur saw him coming. He was sitting on the porch, cleaning his scythe blade with an oiled rag. He stopped his work and waited. Klein stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He took off his hat and held it in his hands. He looked tired, the professional confidence completely gone, replaced by a raw humility. "Mr. Pearsall," he said, his voice quiet, "I came to say that I was wrong." It was a simple, direct admission. There was no excuse, no attempt to justify his earlier advice. It was the plain acknowledgement of a mistake. Arthur Pearsall gave a slow nod. He gestured with his head toward the other rocking chair on the porch. "Sit down, son," he said. Klein sat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound were the buzz of a few late summer insects and the distant caw of a crow. Finally, Klein broke the silence. "I don't understand it," he said, looking out at the green orchard. "Everything I learned, everything the data shows, says your trees should be dead. They should have been the first to go, but they're the only ones left. How?" This was the moment. The protagonist explains. But Arthur did not launch into a lecture. He did not gloat. He finished wiping down his scythe blade, stood it carefully against the porch railing, and then he stood up. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you." He led Klein not into the center of the orchard, but to the edge, where the dense green of his land met the parched brown of the neighboring hayfield. He knelt down, his old knees protesting only slightly. He beckoned for Klein to join him. The young man knelt, his clean trousers pressing into the clover. Arthur parted the vegetation. "Look here," he said, his voice low and factual. He pointed to the ground. "See how dark it is? Feel it." Klein tentatively touched the soil. It was cool and slightly spongy, like a wrung-out cloth. "Now feel this," Arthur said, reaching a few feet over, across the invisible line of his property, and touching the bare ground of the hayfield. Klein did the same. The contrast was shocking. The field soil was hot to the touch, hard and unyielding as pavement. "My father taught me," Arthur began, "that the ground is a living thing. You treat it like a factory floor, it starts to act like one. It won't do anything for you unless you bring everything to it. You pave it with sun, you get a parking lot. Hot in the summer, cold in the winter. Nothing lives there." He pointed back to the clover and the vetch. "This here is its skin, its blanket. It is a few things. First, it shades the ground, keeps the sun off. That alone makes a world of difference. Cuts down on your evaporation more than you can measure with that probe of yours." He dug his fingers into his own soil and pulled up a small clump. He broke it apart in his palm. A small earthworm wriggled. Second, it keeps the life in the soil. The worms, the bugs, the things you can't see. They're the ones that build the soil up, make it a sponge. When it rains, my land drinks. Bare ground. It sheds water like a tin roof. Most of it runs off, taking your topsoil with it. You picked a leaf of clover. This is a legume. It makes its own nitrogen. Free fertilizer. The tree knows that. The roots of the apple tree and the roots of this clover, they work together. They ain't fighting. They're partners. He then pointed to a nearby chicory plant, its tough stalk rising up. That one there, its root goes down 4, maybe 5 feet, deeper than the tree's feeder roots. It goes down into the deep clay and pulls up minerals. Potassium, calcium. When the plant dies, or when I cut it with the scythe, those minerals are left right here in the topsoil, a meal for the apple tree. It's a pump, bringing up treasure from the basement. He looked at Klein, whose face was a mask of intense concentration. The young agronomist was not just hearing words. He was receiving a completely new operating system for his understanding of the land. The book knowledge, it's a good thing, Arthur said, his tone respectful, not condescending. But it only tells you part of the story. It tells you what happens in 1 year with one plant. It doesn't always tell you what happens over 50 years with a whole community of plants. This orchard ain't just a bunch of apple trees. It's a forest, a managed forest, and a forest knows how to take care of itself. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands. In a wet year, Frank Miller, he'll get more apples than me. Bigger apples, too. His way is good for that. My way, it's for this year. It's for the year the rain forgets to come. It's slower. It's messy, but it's safer. My father didn't farm for the best year. He farmed so that he could survive the worst. Klein stood up slowly, a dazed look in his eyes. He looked from the old man to the green trees, and for the first time, he did not see weeds. He saw a system. He saw a deep, profound, and practical wisdom that made his textbooks seem thin and incomplete. "Thank you," he said, and the words were heavy with meaning. "Thank you, Mr. Pearsall." The knowledge was adopted. David Klein went back to his office at the county extension. He took the file for the Pearsall farm, filled with his earlier, arrogant notes, and he put it in the shredder. He started a new file. He spent the next week researching. He looked up archaic terms like green manure and polyculture. He found obscure academic papers from the 1940s that talked about the benefits of permanent clover cover in orchards. He discovered a whole branch of agricultural science that had been pushed aside in the rush for chemical solutions after World War II. He wrote a new report. It was a report on drought-resilient strategies in Calhoun County. He did not fill it with charts and graphs. He filled it with observations. He wrote about Arthur Pearsall's farm. He used phrases he had never used before: symbiotic ground cover, living mulch, soil organic matter, mycorrhizal symbiosis. He was translating the old man's practical wisdom into the language his superiors at the university would understand and respect. He recommended that the county immediately establish a new cost-share program, not for irrigation, but for planting cover crops. He submitted the report. It caused a stir. It was radical. It was a direct contradiction of 50 years of conventional advice. But it had one thing going for it that no other report had. It was backed up by the only green orchard in a brown and withered county. The rains finally came in September. Not a deluge, but a series of slow, soaking rains that lasted for days. The land, so long thirsty, drank deeply. On the bare, tilled fields, the water puddled and ran off, carving gullies in the eroded soil. In Arthur's orchard, it soaked in, every drop captured by the sponge he had spent a lifetime building. The new stasis began to set in. The story of Arthur Pearsall's orchard became a piece of local lore. The talk at the co-op changed. The pity was gone, replaced by a grudging, then a genuine respect. Farmers who had once mocked his weeds would now stop him by the feed aisle and ask, "Arthur, what was that stuff you had growing under your trees?" That clover, Frank Miller, his own orchard in near total loss, came by one afternoon. He did not apologize, not in words. But he asked Arthur if he knew where a man could buy a 50-pound bag of white clover seed. It was his form of surrender. Arthur's success was no longer a strange anomaly. It became an accepted fact, a part of the county's geography and its history. Pearsall's place was no longer the messy orchard. It was the orchard that survived the '88 drought. The symbol of its success was the trees themselves, which, when harvest time came, were laden with bright, flavorful apples. Arthur hired a few local teenagers to help him pick, and the crop, though smaller than usual, fetched a premium price at the markets. One cool morning in October, a young man appeared at the farm. His name was Leo, the grandson of a neighbor whose farm had been badly hit. Leo was quiet, observant, and had been working his family's land since he was old enough to walk. He had watched Arthur all summer, not with judgment, but with a quiet, growing curiosity. He found Arthur sharpening the blade of his sickle bar mower, preparing to finally cut the cover crop down for the winter. Leo stood for a moment, waiting to be acknowledged. Arthur finished his file stroke and looked up. "Leo," he said. "Mr. Pearsall," the young man said. "I was wondering something." "Go on." "My grandpa, he's talking about plowing everything under this fall. Says he needs to start fresh next year." "But I saw your trees." "I saw them all summer." Leo paused, gathering his words. "I was wondering if you could show me. About the clover. About how you do it." This was the passing of the torch. It was not a formal request, not an application for a job. It was a plea for knowledge. Arthur looked at the young man, at his calloused hands and his earnest, intelligent eyes. He saw the same curiosity he had once had, the same desire to understand the land on its own terms. He saw a successor. Arthur gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Get the other wrench from the toolbox," he said, gesturing toward the barn. "This cutter bar needs to be aligned. We can talk while we work." He later showed Leo the old notebook, the one filled with the spidery handwriting of his father and grandfather. He opened it to a page from 1934. "Here," he said, "Grandfather wrote this. The wind took Henderson's soil today. Ours held. The vetch is a strong anchor, it's all in here. Not the how-to, exactly. Just the why." Leo touched the brittle page with a reverence that Arthur understood completely. The notebook was not just a record. It was the physical embodiment of the knowledge, a tangible link in an unbroken chain. It was a symbol, just as the old 8-in tractor and the Austrian scythe were symbols of a philosophy of endurance, of working with nature rather than trying to conquer it. The seasons turned. The drought of 1988 passed into memory, a benchmark against which all future dry spells would be measured. David Klein's cover crop program was approved. In the springs that followed, more and more fields in Calhoun County began to show the green fuzz of clover and vetch between the rows of corn and in the aisles of orchards. The idea was no longer radical. It was just common sense. Arthur Pearsall continued his work. His rhythm did not change. He still rose before the sun, still walked his land, still listened to what it had to tell him. Leo became a regular presence at the farm, learning to sharpen the scythe, to read the soil on the auger, to understand the subtle language of the plants. He was a good student because he was a good observer. One evening, years later, as the two of them sat on the porch, watching the fireflies rise from the thick green undergrowth of the orchard, Leo asked a question. "Do you think they'll remember? When the rains are steady for a few years, do you think they'll go back to the old way? To the bare ground?" Arthur watched the blinking lights for a long time before he answered. "Some will," he said. "People forget. It's their nature. But it doesn't matter." He leaned forward slightly in his rocking chair, his voice taking on a quiet, philosophical tone. "The land doesn't forget. The knowledge is always right here, waiting. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were needed in the first place."